the next two slides, if nothing else from my presentation sticks for you, these are the things that should stick. We're right now in the middle of what's called AR6, Assessment Report 6 of the IPCC cycle. This is from the main report of AR5. The numbers really haven't changed very much. The lessons, what has come out recently in the SR15 report is the damages for most of these are higher than we expected. But that doesn't change the relationship between emissions and temperatures. On the left, we've got global emissions per year. In 1980, we were down about 20 gigatons per year. We're tapping under 40 at this point. Unfortunately, emissions kind of plateaued for a few years, and then kept on rising. So right now, this is kind of the trajectory we are on right now. And the IEA, Tyler's going to talk about this, we're maybe with recent advancements with electricity generation technology and full implementation of current policies, we're somewhere in this zone. We're heading towards about plus 3C, which is a really dangerous place to be in terms of feedbacks in the global system. Now, if we fully implemented the Paris Agreement nationally determined contributions, we'd be on this kind of yellow path here, sort of heading in the low 2s. It's still a dangerous place to be. All those NDCs added together have to be ratcheted up to get into a sub 2Z zone. And when we start getting into a safer place, 2C requires we go from the emissions where we are today down into the net below the 0 and below 0 zone, somewhere between 2050 to 2070 here. And this is roughly what the SDS, the Sustainable Development Scenario that Tyler's going to be talking about, is kind of looking at with modifications. However, 1.5, which is why I think Tyler brought this point up, requires that we move really fast, and emissions come down to 0 by 2050, and they go into the deep negatives. And the longer it takes us to do that, the more net negatives we're going to have to do. And these negatives are on the scale of 1 to 4 emissions of the entire United States per year that we somehow have to be sucking out of the air, either with land use or with direct emissions capture technologies and pushing them underground. So that's the spread of futures we're looking at right now. However, some folks have pointed out even this one implies some cooperation, that policies stay in place and that almost all new electricity generation technology is zero emission. If we start building a lot more coal plants, we're heading up into this zone. Now, this is from the latest SR 1.5 report by the IPCC. They were asked by the UNFCCC to take a look at what it would take, what the damages were after moving down from 2 to 1.5. And Greg Flatto will be talking about that on Friday. But again, getting to 1.5 requires a really fast drop and deep into the negative zone. 2C is a slightly lower flight path. Longer it takes for us to do it, the more negatives we have to do, but it's a more gradual eventual outcome. Oh, sorry, a key thing here from an economic point of view is that once we get out past 2050, anybody who's still emitting is going to be facing an opportunity cost of somewhere between 100 to 300 dollars per ton. That's what you're going to have to pay in order to keep emitting. So if you've got an investment that's still emitting out past that horizon, depending on how we keep tight we keep the target, that's what you're looking at in terms of a carbon price, if we're trying to stay under 2. Now, again, in terms of LNG, global methane emissions have to drop by at least half. A big chunk of that is oil and gas. Another part of it's cattle methane. So just as an aside, my day job is I run a Latin American deep decarbonization pathways project, and a huge portion of their emissions is land use and cattle methane. So half of Argentina comes from their cow, half of their emissions come from their cows. So, and it's a big part of the Argentinian economy and their identity. So I'm not sure what you do with that, but so. This is the point everyone's been circling around earlier in our discussion. Methane, the natural gas can be potentially worse than coal, depending on the leakage rate from the well to the point of combustion. So there's leakage at the well, there's leakage in the pipes, and there's leakage at anywhere up to the burner. And if the burner's not 100 and there's methane coming out there, now that number needs to be compared against the coal you're burning, because different types of coal have different emissions factors, and when you extract coal, there's coal bed methane that comes up as well. So there's a whole trade-off there. But if you do not control your leakage of methane, you're probably emitting more than coal. So this whole project has to have a very, very low fugitive emissions profile, at least under 3%, ideally towards like 0.5 or 0.5 or less, from the well to the point it gets on the boat. Now, whenever we get around to it, deep decarbonization is doable. This is the optimistic part of my presentation. Increase energy efficiency by at least 50%. This was Tyler's earlier career that I knew him for before he went to Fortis. We need to decarbonize our energy carriers. So we're used to right now buying gasoline at the pump for our cars, burning gas in our furnaces, what have you. We need to transition away from coal, diesel, gasoline, kerosene for aviation fuel, and fossil methane. Remember, what we're after is the combustion of the methane, to decarbonized electricity, bioliquids and gases, hydrogen, potentially synthetic hydrocarbons. So you potentially could have a cycling version of methane where you combust it, CO2 goes up in the atmosphere, you grab it somehow, either as biomass or direct air capture, you rewrap the molecule and recombust it again. But you need a lot of electricity to do that. And switch all end uses, buildings, vehicles, and industry to them. Now, some industrial process changes, that's not what we're talking about here. One thing that is interesting to me from the First Nations perspective is that they have a lot of functional control over a lot of our landscape and how we use it and how we manage it from basically across Canada. One of the things we need to do in terms of agriculture, intensify it, reduce your fertilizer use. Fertilizer is really bad in terms of total net GHG emissions. These are bad terms, rewild and unused, because they're very European ways of looking at the landscape. But if you go back to a First Nations way of managing the landscape with a much higher level of biodiversity, it holds a lot more carbon. So if we can return a lot of our landscape back to that state, that management state, and still manage to have an industrialized economy, you get a big carbon plus. And on top of this, like I said, you're going to need technological negative emissions with biomass, with carbon capture, and direct air capture with CCS at some point or another. But the more we can eliminate our energy system emissions, the more downtake we have from the land base, the less of this expensive stuff we need. One of my favorite scenarios comes from an oil company. And I happen to know the folks who put this scenario together. Shell is not known for its altruism, but it's known for its foresight and planning. And this is their 2C compliant scenario that came out a couple of years ago. And there's a lot of information in here that's really germane to LNG Canada. And you'll watch through time, here our oil goes up and starts coming down. Coal flattens, starts coming down. The longest profile here is on the natural gas, and then it starts coming down. And there's going to be a lot of price fluctuation at this point in here, depending on the long-term economics of the projects. But there's a longer-term horizon. Of all the fossil fuels, it's got the longest-term horizon. Where the Shell scenario gets really fun is watching what happens to wind, to nuclear, to biomass, and solar PV. It takes off. And it's not being used just for its electricity. That electricity is being transformed into other things. It's being transformed into hydrogen, into synthetic hydrocarbons, what have you. And I'll be talking about that in just a second. So electrification is the default. Okay, we know how to make clean electricity. We know how to run most end uses, up to 80% of them on electricity. But it can be very expensive. The capacity you've got to run, getting to where the intense heat you may need in industry. Can we run a hybrid electric, hydrogen, and synthetic hydrocarbon system? So this is where you start with surplus decarbonized electricity. It can come from wind, solar, fossil CCS, nuclear. The North Coast has amazing wind resources. Capacity factors 60–70% plus. And the cost of making these offshore floating units has fallen dramatically thanks to the Europeans. So there is the possibility of an offshore industry off of Prince Rupert and Haida Gwaii if it's managed properly. Now you take that electricity, use as much of it as you can directly, but if you've got certain times of the day when you've got more than you need, you split it into hydrogen and oxygen. The oxygen's got all sorts of uses all on its own. The hydrogen can also potentially, in a sort of a bridging way, you can make it from natural gas. So you split apart, you mine natural gas for its hydrogen, but you have to make sure the CO2 goes underground for the whole process to be net zero compatible. Once you've got that clean hydrogen, all sorts of interesting things become possible. Ammonia is a liquid under light pressure. You can run ships off of it. You can synthesize. You can run heavy freight, what have you, off of it. You can run it in a fuel cell. And once you've got clean hydrogen, oxygen, this is the next one I want to get to. This is a big one that we don't talk about enough in Canada. We've got clean hydrogen, clean oxygen, but what about clean carbon? So there's all sorts of ways of getting a functionally clean net zero carbon. You start with legacy carbon capture and reuse, followed by woody biomass gasification. The way we use biomass today in Canada is almost criminal in terms of extracting value from it. If you gasify it at 850 C, all sorts of hydrocarbons come out of it, and you can take that mixture of various hydrocarbon chemicals, mix it with extra hydrogen, mix it with oxygen, and you can make methane, methanol, ethanol, diesel, jet fuel, chemicals, what have you. You have a whole system that's still functionally hydrocarbon based, but it's the source of the carbon that matters. It's not coming from a fossil source. It's cycling in and out of the air. It's cycling in and out of your biomass base. It's coming out of your legacy industry. That's one concept. The other one is in terms of the long-term potential for the LNG grid. While new should be net zero based by the 2030s, we've got a huge, and Tyler and I get tangled up in Twitter conversations endlessly about this topic. But there's a lot of legacy buildings and industry out there that run on natural gas. So the way the system currently runs, you've got a legacy long-distance natural gas line. It feeds the grid, and then it feeds your industry, buildings and homes. There's a lot of things you can do with that. You can, using gasification, biorefineries, renewable natural gas, you can gradually replace greater and greater amounts of the fossil methane in the grid, bringing down the intensity when it's burnt. If you've got surplus electricity, you can put up to 10% hydrogen into this grid without any trouble. Beyond that, it starts eating away at the steel and the joints. But in some places, they have plastic gas lines, and they can take up as much hydrogen as you want. You can synthesize you can make completely synthetic methane and fill the grid. And now it's going to be expensive stuff, but in places like Manhattan, downtown Toronto, downtown Vancouver, it's going to be more than worth it, like having to rip out all of your system. I can see Tyler's winding up for a yeah. Anyway, and you can boost the system using solar electricity. Heat comes from various sources, and you can potentially run electricity to support the system. If you're running a high wind and solar system that's going up and down, you can use gas out of that grid to keep the system stable. So that's yet another way of looking at the system. I won't go into this, there's too much information here, but it's basically all the legacy emissions we have, how we might approach getting them down to net zero. Now, moving on to the questions here. The questions every region has to ask itself going out in sort of the 30 to 50 year horizons. Where do my emissions currently come from? Are they projected to grow or shrink one way or the other? With LNG Canada, yep, they're going to grow unless you mitigate them. Is it for domestic use or export? A detailed scenario forecasting is needed, and that's what you're in the process of trying to do. If I were the North Coast First Nations, I'd be asking, what are my competitive disadvantages or advantages in a net zero world? What's my access to clean electricity? What's my access to biomass? What's my access to CCS geology? And there actually is CCS geology off the BC. If we've got gas and oil, we can do CCS. And my people. Do I have the people to run such a system? The other thing is our planning and regulatory structure for net zero, ready for net zero emissions governance? And I did a presentation for the BCUC on this. Is the utilities regulator empowered and equipped to manage at the same time a shrinking gas grid where we're keeping the essential components of it and an expanding electricity system at the same time? So we're clipping off the unessential parts of the gas grid that could potentially be leaking, but we're keeping the parts that help it act as an energy battery, potentially serving as our legacy buildings, industry, what have you, while making sure all the new stuff is electric. And who's going to fight this? Who's going to support this? How to engage them? And what is my adaptive vision or plan going forward? Now, this is something I can save for the other presentation. It's a way of approaching of a given region, set of stakeholders approaching. How do you look at the future? You come up with different, effectively qualitative narratives or stories of how you adapt to this future. Now, to make sure they're not just vaporing, you do some modeling, you do some quantitative modeling attached to those, and you bring your various your stakeholders' narratives and dashboards together to see if they're actually compliant with a net zero future, and if you're not, you cycle around. But in so doing, what you're effectively doing is building community knowledge. You're building something approaching a working consensus that you can actually get some policy going. Yeah, and that's the question I have about LNG. There's been too many cases in BC and Canada's history where we've had a boom and bust industry come along, employ a lot of people, and then it dies away. LNG very really could be something that's a stepping stone to building a much more complex a macroeconomic system around Prince Rupert, around the North Coast, building the trade skills, building the planning skills, building the steps to like a broader industrial base. But you need that plan, you need that vision. So possible opportunities for the First Nations and the North Coast in particular, and now I'm starting to vapor. People at this table are going to know a lot more about this than I do. Most of the Canadian North is going to matter a lot from a resource. And when I say a follow, that's agriculture, forestry, and land use. We really need Canada's land base to become a carbon sink. And the problem is it has historically been a carbon sink, and now it's tending into a carbon source because it's been drying out, heating up, and it's part of why we're having such fire seasons. We need active management of our land base such that the sink is maximized. And really, I can't think of anybody better to do it than our First Nations, given that they're on the land to start with. A vision is needed. There's also a chance to reset the development paradigm here, where we industrialize the North, we bring employment, we bring development, but we keep it in a maximum biodiversity, maximum carbon sink state. The other thing is the BC North Coast has a first-class offshore resource on a global scale. Costs have come down to cheaper than coal and gas in a lot of places, and Prince Rupert is a very good port. It's got access to Asia, and it's potentially got access for geological storage for CO2. It could be, starting with as I was mentioning, a net zero hydrogen and synthetic hydrocarbon hub. You know, if it's managed well, if it's managed cleanly, if it's managed for the well-being of the people who live there. Is it possible to establish a prosperous, fair, and primarily First Nations-led clean development zone in that part of Canada? So, in summary, we're wildly off track for 1.5 2C for most sectors. Transport and buildings are the big exceptions, and electricity. However long it takes us to change course, a path does exist that allows for a transition, even instead of a destructive revolution, but the snapback is getting harder. As the more time we allow emissions to go up, the harder the fall is going to be. Under responsible governance, our north can be both basically a well-managed development zone, carbon sink, and the BC, the North Coast First Nations are in a driver's seat in potentially a first-class green development zone. The question is, what do they want to do with that opportunity? So that is it. And this, if people were interested at some point, this was a policy package for Canada that I've evolved with various people over the last 5 years, and how do we get to net zero as a society in terms of regulations, carbon pricing, innovation support, land use management. The other thing is our methane regs are good, but they need to get a whole lot better. Minus 45 is not good enough. It should be minus 80 to minus 90. That is the management regime we should be running within the oil and gas sector. You know, it should be down to only safety releases, basically. Anyway, that's it.
I just appreciated the last slide. Didn't understand half of it, but appreciated the reference to policy, because that's why we're here. And we know the discussions that occurred, or negotiations that occurred for potential project in Prince Rupert. And the reason we're here is we've had proponents come and meet with us about potential for LNG pipeline through Nisga'a lands. We've also had proponents come and meet with us for potential projects on Nisga'a lands because of the potential for port development at the foot of the Nass River. One of the issues that I keep coming back to, and it's referenced in the purpose, is identification of relevant policy issues. So that's why I appreciated the last slide with reference to policy. We're receiving all of this information, and a lot of it I admit I have to really concentrate to try and understand the technical information. I guess the issue I'm trying to understand is how do we translate all of the technical information into the issues for the policy development, because that's why we're here. That's why we set aside our own nation issues to come together to support the initiatives. And I can see you're passionate about the information you present, and it would be really interesting to take a course with you, because that's something that stimulates my mind and see beyond what my current understanding is to understand the details and to understand the potential for what I saw was some chemistry. And it's been a long time since I've had to think about any type of molecules, but I can see the potential, and to look beyond this table to see how there is potential to go beyond just what we understand as LNG and electrification and just power generation. But it's the coming back to the policy issue. How does all of this translate to the policy issue? And I don't know if Dave's on the line, but maybe it's a question for Dave.
I love policy. I could talk about policy all day. again, you need an overarching framework. I think part of this is I think the big part of the struggle we're having with LNG as a society, and all the components, is we don't have an overall vision of where the country's going on this file. We don't have a clear understanding. There isn't a bottom-top understanding of what net zero means, what climate change means in terms of ultimate impacts. Like, net zero is coming, sooner or later. The sooner it comes, the less painful it's going to be. If it takes to 2080, if it takes to 2100, that's what it'll be. But the earlier it can happen, the better off we're all going to be. But we need a collective vision, and we need to build legal framework. We need to build carbon pricing systems. We need to build regulations for most of our sectors. We need to, our oil and gas industry is a mainstay for several of our provinces, and it's going to be keep on being that for several more decades, but it needs an evolutionary path off of combustion of fossil fuels to atmosphere, to petrochemical, to chemicals, construction, to any stuff that works within the net zero paradigm. And frankly, I believe they're essential for that, because they're the only people that really know how to treat mass bulk chemicals as Lego, using outside energy sources, but doing it without emitting to atmosphere. But we need that's the point the national conversation has to arrive at. Then questions about whether or not LNG makes sense become a lot easier.
Dave, the issue that I was trying to understand was with all of this information, and in the last presentation there was a reference to the policy and how do we distill all of this information down into the policy process?
That's a great question, because if you go back to when this whole FNCI thing started, and remembering where it came from. So at that time, the province was kind of just finishing up, the Clean BC plan, and it had it out there, and when that plan was published, it begged the question, well, and everyone started asking, including the proponents and the projects that want to build things, but more importantly, the nations who want to be involved, and were being visited by these companies with all these ideas. People started asking, well, how in the heck can you have these reduction goals, which are pretty ambitious inside Clean BC, and at the same time have an LNG industry? And my answer was, yeah, that's a really good question, and we actually, on its surface, you can't. But at the same time, there's no way you're going to get the province and the premier and others who really actually appreciate the importance of the energy industry and really mean it when they talk about the ability for nations to have economic self-determination. Like, those become really, on the surface, unreconcilable problems. And so it was through the process of trying to wrestle with that the FNCI was born. And I think the answer to your question, Eva, is this process and your group of nations, which I know is probably going to grow, I think will have a substantial amount of influence into this government or any future government to help us answer that question with you. Because right now, if we were to take a one-dimensional stance on climate change and Clean BC and targets and say the targets are the targets and everything else is secondary, I think that would be incredibly disrespectful and sure as heck would not be aligned with what we're also saying around UNDRIP and DRIPA and our new intentions around allowing nations to make up their own minds on these things and to be in partnership with us as we try to do that. And this is why, I've said it before, I'm so impressed with this process, because you are creating inside the government a real conundrum, and that's a good thing, because we need to answer it. And right now we're in the process of, I would say, taking input and trying to wrestle that down. And this goes back to probably the biggest point I made earlier in some of my comments was, if we could imagine and it's a big imagination required, but if we could imagine that LNG exports are net zero, in other words, including the upstream, including fugitives, including the pipelines, including the production process, and all of the whole thing, if we could get the whole value chain to be net zero emissions, problem solved. Now I don't have a conundrum anymore. Now I can hit my targets inside Clean BC and support the industry. And by the way, nations, get their piece of that pie. They get to the economic prosperity and all of that. So if we can't do that, I worry because Clean BC, this government, its position on climate change is temporal. There will be another election. It might be this government again. It might be a green government. It might be a conservative government. It might be a liberal government. But the governments come and governments go, and policies change when that happens. And so the amazing opportunity that's on the table for us collectively right now is this idea that we might be able to stop climate and climate policy from being a political football. Like, how amazing would that be? Where it doesn't matter what stripe you are politically, you don't have to use it as a political football. Like, it just happened in Alberta, it happened in Ontario, it happened in Australia, and now all we're talking about is what's it look like between here and there. And so I know I'm kind of drifting off to answer your question, Eva, but I can tell you what I worry about is we can't have this become a binary policy conversation where you gotta pick a side. And that's happening inside the government I work for, where you get these debates going, well, you have to pick a side. Are you on the green side, or are you on the industry side, or the First Nations side, or whatever? And so what I'm trying to do as part of that is not, I don't want to be part of that conversation. I want to create a win-win. So hopefully that helps a little bit answer your question anyways.
So Dave, it's Corinne, and one of the challenges we had as NISHCA, speaking with proponents, is we had willing proponents, and we were willing to speak with anyone that would provide us with the capacity funding to have the conversations. But we were missing this piece, the policy piece. So we've had meetings with proponents from China, Japan, all of those countries that are wanting the resources. So this process was attractive to us, to our leadership, to be engaged in the policy process. So we were supportive of the process. Now I'm just trying to understand how we go from all of this information to distill it down. But I know we're not done yet. So
yeah, and you do have to connect all. Thanks for that, Corinne. And we and you and the FNCI does need to ultimately decide. Okay, I've heard enough, I've learned enough, and now I have a position. And then, and I think that goes for the NGOs, that goes for industry, that goes, everybody's gonna have to decide, okay, are we gonna try to do the kind of things we're talking about here or not? But as FNCI and as the nations, once you guys have a position, you need to push hard into that policy-making room inside of government, and you're doing that already. Like, I know you're seeking meetings with the Premier and others at the Northern Resources Forum, and you guys have your own channels into the Premier's office and all those things. I really, really agree that you guys need to push hard on that and demand a seat at the table, and that's, if we weren't prepared to do that before, which I think we always were, but especially since we passed our DRIPA legislation, like, that demands that you have a seat at that table. And I don't know how the movie's going to end yet. I'm just part of the puzzle, but I think that at some point you got to pivot from these learning sessions into, okay, we have a position, and it's a collective position, and we want to see at the table and give us and demand an answer.
Just a couple things. That last discussion was great, and those of you that have taken the time to read the MOU that created this process know that the nations didn't draft and sign the MOU because they wanted to just learn about this stuff. It's because they wanted to make change happen, and the change has to happen in policy. And the purpose of these sessions is to make sure we're informed before we decide what the change has to be. And so really, we're having this session. We had asked Chris to speak to this and Dan in a moment because we wanted to know where are we going, not just like can we do electrified LNG and reduce, like where does that take us? Like what is that low carbon economy? What's that future that you're describing, and a lot of us struggling to keep up with you and understanding what that all means. And so I guess what I'm appealing to everyone, particularly those of you who are knowledgeable about that potential future, to don't be shy about telling us what you think the policy framework is that would facilitate getting from here to there. So think of it as an open invitation to tell the nations what you think the policy changes or developments that are required to get us to that future. And everyone's grown up and will decide what they want to do, but if we don't know, we can't even choose. So please be more specific and direct about those kinds of policy changes that might enable that kind of future to materialize. We wanted to have a session just on policy. We want to be ready for that. It's like we're all getting ready for that conversation. But as we go along here in this presentation and the next one, Dan, your policy ideas are really good. So there's some really simple concrete ones like the methane regs, what should they be? But there's obviously much more complex ones in terms of facilitating the kinds of industrial futures that you were just talking about, Chris. Go ahead, Tamara.
I probably harp on this every time I talk to any group of people, but as a former lobbyist and also someone pretty engaged in the political process, don't forget the value of storytelling. Policy is important and it's fundamental, facts are essential, and they provide the basis of scenarios that could be beneficial. That's excellent. But having an elegant story to tell that is compelling, that is emotional, that is visual, that hits people in their hearts, and something that is tellable and understandable to a large group of people beyond just the kind of experts, that's when you start really being able to push governments to make decisions. I can tell you, I've had more than a number of clients where the business case was okay, the policy solution was pretty good, but the story sure was great. And that's what ended up kind of tilting over to the place where we won the day. And so those two things together, a great story that's very elegant, that's very much hits emotionally, and then also built on a foundation of solid policy, that's when the magic really starts happening. And I think we're in an amazing position to be able to have this happening with First Nations because there's such a deep and long history and expertise in that kind of storytelling that we can bring to the table once we figure out the policy side of things.
One thing, there's an opportunity here to consider and advocate for what is net zero transition compatible oil and gas policy, and it's in this very specific case, it means that but when the gas comes out of the ground, gets processed, gets stripped and cleaned, goes down the pipe, gets to the ship, and then heads off to the ship. What you want the whole system to be eventually retrofittable to zero end to end. Right? Which means full 100% CCS, which the Norwegians have already been doing for a generation. This is my frustration. Like this should have been standard at 20 years ago because you're sitting right on top of the water you can re-inject on the reservoir you can re-inject into. You've got CCS. You're handling you're not using gas actuated devices. It's all electric devices along the line. It's electric compressors to get the gas to the port, and it's eventually full electrification of the of the liquefaction compressors. Now, that is a net zero compatible LNG facility. You don't have to do it all at once, but as long as it's built to take that, to adapt to that as climate policy ramps up, you can call it net zero compatible.